Imagine attending a Halloween party, surrounded by laughter and excitement, only for the night to take a horrifying turn that will haunt a town forever. This is the chilling true crime story of Martha Moxley, a young girl's life cut short in the most brutal way. Who was the killer? What drove a seemingly innocent Halloween gathering to become a nightmare? Stick with us as we unravel the shocking twists of this case and uncover the mystery that still grips the town to this day. You won't believe the truth behind Martha's murder. Keep watching till the end. It was Halloween night. The streets glowed with the flicker of jack-o'-lanterns. Children ran in costumes, laughter echoing. But the Moxley house, nestled in the darkened corner, stood silent. Inside, Martha Moxley, dressed as a witch, was getting ready for the party. Her friends had all arrived. The air was thick with excitement and anticipation. The smell of candy and popcorn filled the room. Laughter spilled into the hallway. But beneath it, a strange tension hung. Something felt wrong. Martha could feel it in her gut. The music was louder than usual. The walls seemed to vibrate with it. As she moved through the crowd, her eyes met his. Tommy, her neighbor. His gaze lingered too long, too intense. She smiled, brushing it off. But his stare burned into her skin. The night wore on. The drinks flowed. People danced and joked, unaware. Martha tried to push away the unease, but it followed her, lurking. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, everything changed. A loud crash. Glass shattered. The music stopped. Everyone froze. Martha's heart raced. She turned to find Tommy, standing in the doorway. His eyes were wide, bloodshot. He was breathing heavily. His shirt, once white, was stained dark red. And in his hand, something glinted. A knife. Martha's stomach twisted. She backed away, a chill creeping down her spine. The room was silent. Then the screaming started. It was muffled at first, but the sounds of panic grew louder. Tommy advanced, moving towards her. His smile was twisted, almost mocking. Martha tried to scream, but her voice failed. The knife gleamed as he stepped closer. Everything seemed to slow. The party, the laughter, the joy, all of it vanished. And in its place was fear. Pure terror. Tommy's steps echoed in the silence, each one louder than the last. Martha stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The room felt suffocating. The walls, once alive with noise and light, now seemed to close in on her. Her breaths were shallow, frantic. She glanced around the room, looking for an escape. But the door was too far. The windows were sealed shut. Her mind raced. What was happening? Why was Tommy like this? She opened her mouth to scream, but only a faint whimper escaped. Tommy stopped in front of her. His eyes never left hers. He raised the knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light, reflecting her terrified face. Martha's legs shook. Her body screamed for her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Tommy's voice broke the silence. "Don't worry, Martha," he said, his voice cold, flat. "It'll all be over soon." His words sent a chill through her. Her mind couldn't process it. What had happened to him? Why did this night take this turn? The knife came down. Martha felt the cold metal against her skin. Pain exploded in her side. She gasped, unable to breathe. Her vision blurred. The sounds of the party, the screams, all faded into nothing. Only Tommy's face remained, his expression unreadable. The knife was in her again, and again. Her body was limp, the life draining out of her. But she couldn't look away from his eyes. Her world spun. The blood pooled around her. The laughter of the party felt distant, unreal. Then, as the darkness took over, Martha's last thought was of the party. How it had all been so wrong from the start. A nightmare dressed in the guise of a celebration. And Tommy, once a neighbor, now a monster. The house, now stained with her blood, would tell her story. But no one would be prepared for the truth. Tommy stepped back, breathing heavily, his hands trembling. The knife still clutched tightly in his grip. The room, once full of life, was now frozen in terror. No one dared move. The people who had laughed and danced just moments ago were now paralyzed with fear. Some were still staring at Tommy, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Others were trying to escape, scrambling toward the back door, but it was locked. Panic spread like wildfire. Martha lay there, lifeless, her once vibrant costume soaked in crimson. The music that had filled the air earlier now seemed like a distant memory. There was only the sound of heavy breathing and the eerie silence that followed the violence. Tommy stood motionless for a long moment, staring down at her. His chest rose and fell, as if he was trying to process his own actions. The room was still. Then, suddenly, the reality of what had happened hit everyone at once. The first person screamed. Then another. The chaos erupted. Someone called the police. But in the midst of the panic, no one dared approach Tommy. He was a force, something otherworldly in that moment. A predator. Martha's blood stained the floor, and the air was thick with fear. Time seemed to stretch, but it didn't matter. No one was going to save her now. The sounds of sirens in the distance began to grow louder. But for those who had been at the party, it was too late. The damage was done. And as Tommy stood there, the weight of what he had done finally began to sink in. But there was no remorse, no apology, only the cold emptiness of a killer, lost in his own actions. The scene before him was a nightmare, a Halloween turned to horror. As the police arrived, Tommy didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood there, still as stone, waiting. Martha's body lay in front of him, a silent witness to the brutal act. And the night that had promised fun and celebration would forever be remembered for the terror that unfolded. A Halloween party, a murder, and one twisted mind. A story that no one could forget. The police burst through the door, their boots slamming against the wooden floor. The chaos inside hit them all at once. Flashes of red, shocked faces, blood on the walls. But there, in the middle of it all, stood Tommy, the weapon still in his hand. His eyes were hollow, distant, as though nothing around him registered. He didn't flinch when the officers shouted at him to drop the knife. He didn't even blink. "Tommy, put it down," one officer yelled, stepping forward, his hand hovering near his holster. But Tommy was unshaken. He just stared at them. His gaze was as cold and blank as the blade in his hand. It was as though he wasn't even there anymore. The room was frozen in fear, but the officers didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, disarming him, taking him to the ground with practiced force. The knife clattered to the floor. But Tommy didn't resist. He let them handcuff him, his face blank. The weight of what had happened didn't seem to settle in. His eyes never left the blood-stained floor. They dragged him out of the house, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. The others watched in stunned silence. The horror of the night still clung to the air. Some couldn't look away from Martha's lifeless body. Her friends, her neighbors, were in shock. No one knew what to say. What could they say? They had all just witnessed a nightmare unfold in front of them. Martha had been taken from them so violently, so suddenly. The house, once full of laughter and fun, now felt like a tomb. Outside, the cold night air hit Tommy's face. But he didn't react. He was numb. The officers put him into the back of the squad car. And as they drove away, the party house behind them stood silent. The flashing lights of the police cars cast long shadows on the street. The neighborhood would never be the same. The Moxley family's life would never be the same. And neither would the lives of those who had been there that night. The Halloween party. It wasn't just a night of celebration. It was a night that would haunt everyone forever. Tommy's motives, his reasoning, were unknown. But the brutal murder of Martha Moxley was just the beginning of a long, complicated case. One that would stir rumors, speculation, and eventually deep legal battles. The horror of that night would live on in everyone's mind. The days that followed were filled with questions. Questions that no one could answer. Why had Tommy done it? What had driven him to such an unspeakable act? Martha's friends and family were left in a fog of disbelief, struggling to understand how someone they thought they knew could commit such horror. The once tight-knit neighborhood felt fractured. The echoes of that Halloween night haunted every corner, every conversation. Investigators dug deeper, searching for any clue, any hint of what had led to the murder. But Tommy remained silent. He said nothing. Not a word of explanation. Not a word of regret. He was a puzzle no one could solve. The media picked up the story, turning it into a sensation. Headlines screamed about the Halloween horror and the brutal murder of Martha Moxley. The details were twisted, the facts distorted, but the one thing everyone agreed on was the shock of it all. How could a Halloween party, a night meant for fun, end in such a horrific way? The community, once filled with life and warmth, was now overshadowed by fear and suspicion. People kept their doors locked. Neighbors avoided one another. And Tommy, the boy who had once been just a neighbor, was now a monster in the eyes of everyone who had once known him. The trial began months later, and it was a media frenzy. Every moment, every detail of the case was dissected and discussed. But still, no one could explain Tommy's actions. Was it a crime of passion? Was it premeditated? Some speculated about mental illness, but no one could say for sure. Tommy's defense team argued that he had been in a state of temporary insanity, but it didn't matter. Martha Moxley's life had been taken in an instant, and there would be no bringing her back. Her family, her friends, would forever carry the weight of that night with them. Her name, once a symbol of youth and promise, would be forever tied to the tragedy of her brutal murder. And Tommy? He was sentenced. But nothing could undo the pain, the horror, the memory of that night. A Halloween party turned into a nightmare. The terror of it would never fade. And neither would the questions. What had really happened that night? What had pushed Tommy over the edge? Some mysteries, it seemed, would never be solved. The story of Martha Moxley would linger, forever a reminder of how quickly joy could turn to fear. The years passed, but the shadows of that night never fully lifted. Martha Moxley's name was spoken with sorrow. Her absence became a hole in the community that no one could fill. Her family lived in a quiet grief, one that didn't fade with time. The memory of her bright smile, her laugh, was forever marred by the violence of her final moments. Tommy, now behind bars, showed no signs of remorse. He sat in silence, year after year, his face unchanged, his eyes as empty as the night he'd taken Martha's life. His case became a topic of cold fascination for some, a tragic mystery for others. Psychologists and criminologists debated what could have led a seemingly ordinary young man to commit such a horrifying crime. Was he born this way? Or was there something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to emerge? Some pointed to Tommy's troubled past, his distant relationship with his family, his brief flashes of aggression in his younger years. Others suggested a deeper psychological issue, one that even he hadn't fully understood. But none of it mattered. Martha was still gone, and Tommy's fate was sealed. For the community, the damage was done. There were those who said they'd never forget what happened. They'd never forget the way Halloween had been twisted into something monstrous. And there were those who tried to move on. They tried to forget. But the house, the street, the memories, all held the weight of that night. Martha's friends grew up with the scars of what they'd witnessed. Her family would always wonder how one night, one moment, could change everything. They had all been given a glimpse into the darkness that can hide behind the most familiar faces. And some mysteries, no matter how much time passes, refuse to be solved. What could have saved Martha? What could have stopped Tommy? Was there a sign they missed? Perhaps it didn't matter. Because in the end, what haunted everyone was the question that lingered long after the trial had ended. Could a simple Halloween party ever feel innocent again? For most, it never could. As the years wore on, the town tried to rebuild itself, but something intangible was lost. Halloween came and went, but it never held the same magic. The streets that had once been filled with joy now felt heavy. Costumes, once symbols of fun, now carried a dark memory. The sight of jack-o'-lanterns flickering in the windows was no longer a sign of celebration. It was a reminder of Martha's final night. Her name was spoken less and less in public, but it still lingered in the corners of conversations. Her family, though silent in their grief, never truly healed. They carried their pain quietly, as if they were afraid of burdening anyone else with it. The Moxley home, once filled with laughter, was now quiet, still, untouched. It became a ghost house, a place of mourning that no one dared to enter. But the real ghosts, the ones who haunted the town, were the memories. Memories of a girl taken too soon. Memories of a party turned into a nightmare. Tommy, meanwhile, had grown colder in prison. He no longer spoke to anyone. His face, once familiar to those who lived nearby, became a blur in the eyes of the public. His story was no longer one of a troubled teen, but a symbol of something far more unsettling. A person whose darkness had remained hidden until it could no longer be contained. His trial had been the talk of the town, but as the years passed, the noise surrounding him faded. The case of Martha Moxley became just another tragedy in a long list of unsolved mysteries, rumors, and theories. The truth was buried in the shadow of that night, and no one, not even the police, could piece it together completely. The community may have moved on, but they never truly forgot. Tommy's name, though lost to time, would forever be tied to the horror of that Halloween. And Martha? Her name would remain, too, though not in the way anyone had hoped. It would remain as a warning, a reminder that evil could hide behind even the most ordinary faces, and that sometimes the worst horrors don't come from the outside world. They come from those closest to us. In the end, the town learned to live with the silence. But in the deepest part of their hearts, they knew. Some scars never fade, and some stories never have an ending. The silence stretched on, year after year, as the town tried to bury its ghosts. The echoes of that Halloween night, though faint, never fully disappeared. In the dark corners of conversations, you could still hear whispers of Martha's name. It haunted every street, every house, every life that had been touched by that tragedy. Martha's friends, though they had moved on with their lives, carried a piece of her with them. Every October, when the leaves began to change and the air grew crisp, they couldn't help but think of her. They would remember her laugh, her spirit, the light that had once filled their lives. But they also remembered how it all ended. The brutality, the terror. Tommy had taken more than just her life. He had taken a part of everyone who had known her. And though the town moved on, the shadows of that night still clung to them. For those who had witnessed the horror, they could never forget the way the party had shifted so suddenly. The fear that had spread like wildfire. The sight of the knife. Tommy's face, blank and hollow, would forever be burned into their minds. For years, people tried to understand, to make sense of it all. They questioned the psychology behind it, the motives, the signs they might have missed. But no one truly knew. Tommy remained a mystery, a creature of darkness whose origins no one could trace. He was a boy who had been lost long before that night, and perhaps he had always been lost. As time passed, his name faded from the headlines. But in the minds of those who had lived through that horror, Tommy would always be remembered. Not as the boy they once knew, but as the killer who shattered their world. Martha's case, like so many others, became a cautionary tale, one that was passed down through generations. A reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could turn dark. It was a story that would live on, whispered in the halls of the school, murmured by the older generation to the younger. And though the town had tried to forget, they never could. The pain of that night was woven into the very fabric of their lives. And even as the years turned into decades, the memory of Martha Moxley lingered in the shadows, a presence they couldn't escape. Her life, and her death, would forever remain a part of the town's history. A Halloween party turned into a brutal murder, a tragedy that no one would ever be able to truly understand, but one that would never be forgotten. As the decades rolled on, the town seemed to grow quieter, its people aging, its streets changing. New families moved in, their children unaware of the dark past that lingered in the air. The story of Martha Moxley became a tale told in hushed tones, reserved for those who had been there, who had witnessed the terror firsthand. But even for the new residents, there was a certain heaviness in the atmosphere, an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to the ground itself. Some believed it was just a result of the lingering grief that had settled in over the years, but others, the older generation, knew better. They could still feel it, the pulse of that night, reverberating through time. The local diner, where many of the town's residents gathered, had once been filled with stories of neighborhood gossip, light-hearted chatter, and laughter. But on certain nights, when the air grew colder, there was a noticeable shift. The conversations grew quieter. The laughter, if there was any, seemed hollow. Some of the older patrons would glance nervously toward the windows as if expecting something or someone to appear. The shadow of that Halloween night still loomed. No one dared to speak Tommy's name aloud anymore. But when his story was brought up, it was with the same kind of reverence you'd reserve for a ghost. A ghost who had once been real, flesh and blood, but had now become a symbol of something monstrous. And for some, the idea of closure was as elusive as the truth itself. They would never truly understand why Tommy had done it, why he had shattered so many lives with a single act of violence. Was it the darkness inside him, something that had always been there, waiting to surface? Or was it something more, an unraveling, a breaking point that no one had seen coming? As the years passed, the town tried to move forward, but the absence of Martha, her smile, her warmth, could never truly be replaced. Her absence was a gap that would forever remain, no matter how many Halloween nights came and went. And in that silence, in that lingering grief, the town learned something painful. Some stories are never fully finished. Some chapters never truly close. They simply continue to haunt the places they touched. As much as the town wished to forget, they couldn't escape the truth of what had happened. Martha's murder had cast a shadow too long to ever be fully shaken. It had transformed not just the people involved, but the entire fabric of the community itself. And so, as the seasons changed, as life carried on, that dark chapter of their history remained frozen in time. A Halloween night, a brutal murder, and the forever unanswered question, what could have stopped it? The answers, if they ever existed, remained hidden beneath the weight of time. And perhaps for some, it was better that way. Some things were too terrible to understand. Some things were never meant to be explained. The story of Martha Moxley, once filled with innocence, would forever remain a chilling reminder of how quickly the world could shift. A quiet town, a Halloween night, and a brutal murder that no one could ever forget. As time wore on, the town grew older, its edges softened by the passing years. New generations took root, but the scars left by that fateful Halloween night never truly healed. For the younger crowd, the story of Martha Moxley was little more than a ghost story told by parents, grandparents, or older friends. It was the kind of tale that might spark a chill in the dark, but lacked the true understanding of the pain that had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. But for those who had lived through it, the ones who had heard the screams, witnessed the horror, and felt the shift in the air, the story was far from a ghost story. It was a brutal, unshakable truth that clung to the town like a second skin. And with each passing year, more and more people began to question if the town could ever really escape the shadow of Martha's death. Her family, though they had moved away, never truly found peace. They carried her memory with them, a heavy burden that never lightened. There was no escaping the empty space she had left behind. No matter how far they went or how many years passed, the pain remained. Tommy, still behind bars, became a forgotten name to most, but not to those who remembered the night everything had changed. In prison, his days stretched endlessly, and though the years added years to his life, they did little to bring clarity to what had driven him to such violence. Some said he had been reformed, that his actions had been the result of an irreversible mental break. Others, however, remained convinced that the darkness inside him had never left. The authorities never truly figured out the why. They couldn't reach the source of the madness that had taken over Tommy that night. Had there been warning signs? Had he been a ticking time bomb? Or was it a momentary lapse of sanity, an act that could never be explained? The questions lingered in the minds of those who couldn't let go of the story, the pain, and the mystery. Some people visited the Moxley home, now abandoned, and sat in silence, staring at the windows as if waiting for an answer. Others went to the cemetery where Martha was buried, leaving flowers that seemed to wither as quickly as they were placed. Every visit carried a sense of reverence, but also of helplessness. Her death had left an indelible mark on all who had known her, and no matter how far time moved forward, that mark would never fade. And so, the town carried on, but the weight of Martha's death always remained. No one ever truly forgot, and no one would ever have the answer to the question that haunted them all. What made a Halloween party turn into a brutal murder? Some stories, no matter how much time passes, simply refuse to be untold. Some lives, no matter how brief, leave a legacy that echoes long after the last breath is taken. And the story of Martha Moxley, forever entwined with the horror of that night, would continue to haunt the town. As the decades continued to roll by, the once vibrant town settled into a quiet existence. New houses were built, the streets were repaved, and the world outside seemed to move forward at a pace that the past could not keep up with. But even as life moved on, some of the town's oldest residents could never shake the weight of what had happened all those years ago. Every year, when the leaves began to fall, a subtle, unspoken tension filled the air. It was as though the very earth itself remembered. The younger generation, those who hadn't lived through that terrible night, could never quite grasp the horror that had once paralyzed their parents, their grandparents. To them, it was simply a tragic story, one among many, just another piece of history. But for those who remembered, it was something more. Martha's name still came up occasionally in conversations, though it was said quietly, reverently. It wasn't just the name of a girl lost too soon. It had become a symbol of a moment in time that could never be undone. Her legacy, forever tied to that brutal act, would echo through the town long after the last survivor of that night was gone. The house that had once hosted the party, a symbol of normalcy and youthful excitement, was now just another abandoned relic. People passed by it without a second thought, but to those who remembered, it was a place of nightmares, a place where innocence was forever lost. Some still said the house was haunted, not by ghosts but by memories. Tommy, though he had grown older in prison, never seemed to age in the minds of those who knew him. He remained frozen in time, young, cruel, a face forever linked to a moment of horror. His name had faded from the media, but the story never truly left. Some still wondered if there was more to the story than anyone could understand. Was there something no one had ever figured out? Something that could explain why that night had unfolded the way it had? As the years turned into decades, the world around the town continued to change. New stories filled the newspapers. New tragedies unfolded. Yet, The town's darkest chapter remained at the heart of every whispered conversation, every fleeting glance, every heavy silence that fell over the residents when the subject was broached. The day would come when the last person who had witnessed that Halloween night would pass away, and the story of Martha Moxley would become a faded memory. But as long as there were those left to remember, the shadows of that night would stretch long over the town. Because some stories don't fade. They stay, rooted deep in the soul of a place, forever haunting the hearts of those who lived through them. The town could try to move on, but the specter of that brutal Halloween party would always linger in the distance, a stark reminder of how easily life could slip from joy to terror, and how some things could never truly be forgotten. Martha Moxley's story, her life, her death, would never be fully understood, but it would never, ever be erased. The years continued to pass, and the town gradually took on the appearance of any other small, quiet community. The world around it seemed to spin forward, while the past, particularly the tragedy of that Halloween night, became more of a whispered legend than an immediate terror. New families moved in, unfamiliar with the story that had once gripped the entire neighborhood. But to those who had lived through it, there was no forgetting. The town had tried its best to heal, but there was always something hollow beneath the surface, a quiet reminder that some wounds never fully close. Halloween still came and went, but it was never quite the same. The pumpkins on porches, the costumes in the streets, all seemed to hold a shadow, a hesitation, as if the town collectively held its breath when the holiday arrived. The excitement that once filled the air was now tinged with something darker, something unspoken. The older residents would sometimes gather at the local diner or the small park, sitting on benches that overlooked the empty streets, their conversations turning quiet whenever the topic of that night was brought up. It was as though they feared speaking it aloud would bring it all back, would bring back the horror, the chaos, the blood that had stained the very earth they walked on. And so, as time marched on, the story of Martha Moxley became less about the girl she had been and more about the chilling event she had become a part of. Her life was reduced to the brutal end she had met, her name spoken not in memory of her joy and light, but in the context of something far more sinister. A cautionary tale, a shadow that followed every Halloween. Yet, amidst the pain, there was still a quiet resilience that lived in the town. The families that had endured, the friends who had witnessed the unspeakable, carried on. They found a way to move forward, even if they didn't forget. But no matter how much the world around them changed, the heart of the town would always bear the mark of that night. The very foundation of their existence, of their security, had been shattered by that single act of violence. It was something that no amount of time could erase. The truth behind Tommy's actions, his motives, his reasoning, remained as elusive as ever. Some believed he had been a victim of his own mind, broken beyond repair by forces no one had seen coming. Others thought there was something darker within him, a darkness that had been there all along, waiting to surface. And the family, the ones who had lost their daughter so violently, continued to live in the shadow of their grief, forever mourning the girl who would never grow old. They would never have the answers, never have the closure they so desperately sought. The town's final chapter on the story of Martha Moxley, like a worn-out book left on a shelf, would one day be forgotten by all except those who lived through it. But those who remembered would always carry a piece of her with them, even when the world had moved on. The story may have faded into the past, but the pain would never disappear. Some things, some memories, remain forever etched in the heart. And Martha's was one of those memories. The quiet, unshakable truth that, sometimes, the past is not something you can ever truly escape. It lingers, long after the lights go out, long after the last whispers fade into the night. It lives on, in the echoes, in the shadows. And no matter how much time passes, it never lets go. The town had long moved on, or so it seemed. The years had worn down the sharp edges of grief, and the faces of those who once remembered were replaced by new ones. But deep beneath the surface, something always lingered, a quiet, persistent shadow. The story of Martha Moxley, like a secret, never truly went away. It stayed, a whisper on the wind, in the space between the seasons. By now, few truly remembered what it had been like when the tragedy first struck, when the streets were filled with the horror of a life snuffed out too soon. But the older generation still carried that weight. Every year, as Halloween approached, the chill in the air seemed to bring them back to that night. The screams, the terror, the shock. It was as if the passage of time couldn't erase the imprint of that violence. Though their faces had aged, their hearts had hardened with the quiet sorrow of knowing that some questions were never meant to be answered. In the years following Tommy's conviction, the town went on living, but the shadow of his crime continued to loom large. He sat in prison, his life untouched by the changes that had swept through the world outside. He remained a mystery, a cipher in a life that was defined by one unforgivable act. His name, though no longer shouted in headlines, still carried a weight. Some in the town believed that justice had been served. Others, however, remained unsatisfied. Had they truly uncovered the depths of his darkness? Or was there more to Tommy's story, something still buried beneath layers of fear and silence? Martha's family, though they continued with their lives, were never quite free of their grief. They had tried to heal, tried to carry on, but there was always that emptiness, that unfillable void where Martha had once been. Her absence lingered in their hearts, in their memories. Her story was their story, their pain never fully fading. The town, for all its outward appearance of peace, remained haunted by a party turned tragic, by a life lost in its prime, and by the chilling realization that some things could never be fully understood, no matter how much time passed. And so, the story of Martha Moxley endured, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the fragility of life, of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface, waiting to strike when least expected. It was a tale of horror, yes, but it was also a tale of loss, of lives forever changed, of a community that would never quite heal. The town over the years had slowly transformed. The streets, once thick with fear, were now filled with the everyday bustle of life. Children laughed and played on sidewalks that had once echoed with the chilling silence of a community in mourning. New faces filled the houses that had once belonged to those who lived through the nightmare of that Halloween night. And yet, for all the outward changes, the soul of the town remained unchanged. As the years passed, the memory of Martha Moxley became less of a fresh wound and more of an old scar, still visible but less sharp. It became part of the town's history, woven into its very fabric. People no longer shied away from the topic when it came up in conversation. Instead, they spoke of Martha not only as the victim of a brutal crime, but as a girl who had once been full of life, a young woman whose potential was stolen far too soon. Her story was no longer just one of tragedy. It became a part of the town's identity, a reminder that even in the darkest of moments, light could be found in the memories of those we love. Tommy's name faded from the headlines, his place in the town's history sealed in the past. In prison, he was just another inmate, another lost soul. His face had become as distant and forgotten as the crime he had committed. He was no longer the boy who shattered lives with his violence, but simply another man serving time for his misdeeds. And as the town moved on, so too did the families who had once been so deeply entwined in the tragedy. Martha's parents, though they never fully healed, had found peace in the passage of time. They carried her memory with them always, but they also learned to live again, to find moments of joy amid their sorrow. In the end, the story of Martha Moxley became more than just a tale of horror. It became a testament to resilience. A story of a community that had been broken but, over time, found its way back to healing. It wasn't a perfect recovery. It wasn't a clean break from the past. But in the quiet, peaceful corners of the town, life continued. And in that, there was beauty. The story was not over, but it had finally found its place. A place where the pain no longer defined the town, but the lessons learned from it had become part of its heart, woven into the lives of those who lived there, always and forever. Martha's story, her spirit, would never truly fade. It would live on in the hearts of all who remembered.